Our first speaker has Naperville roots. He's a Naperville Central High School alumni of class of '87. He's a published author, founder and executive director of the Kellogg Innovation Network, and a faculty member of entrepreneurship and innovation at the Kellogg School of Management. I'm proud to introduce Professor Robert Wolcott.
Thanks, Art. And thanks to Art and Ben and all the organizers here having the vision to bring TED to town. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit outside my academic space today. In fact, you're not going to see any statistical regressions, so if anyone would like some, please come to me after the show. Instead, this is going to be a little bit more, perhaps, shall I say, entertaining, and something I call innovating your life. I've spent a lot of time looking at how large corporations, entrepreneurs, government organizations innovate, or perhaps fail to innovate, as the case may be. And in studying all of this, I started also thinking about all the things that we study and teach at business schools. And I started thinking about what we learn and then what we do. And I remember back in the dot-com boom when I was still doing my PhD, myself included, my colleagues at Kellogg were being drawn to Silicon Valley. You remember that dot-com boom? Remember the feeling? Close your eyes, think for a second. Oh yeah, right? I'm going to go to Silicon Valley. I'm going to become an entrepreneur, which meant getting a job, making as much money as an investment banker for 18 months, waiting for the IPO, and then becoming a billionaire. That's my definition of being an entrepreneur, I'll tell you that, right? So everybody ran to the Valley, and they got their jobs, and then we all know what happened. A couple years later, everybody decided they wanted to go into private equity. Well, that sounded pretty good too. Load it up with a bunch of debt, sell it for a lot of money, and then move to Malibu. Well, that's a great job too. Well, we all know what happened to that over the last couple of years with the collapse of the global financial markets. So I started to think about this and realized what we were talking about was a fad cycle. And so how was it that we had all these brilliant, motivated, ambitious young people coming to Kellogg, and some of them not so young, by the way. We have students up to the age of 55 or 60 even who are coming with exceptional experience, and we're learning about differentiation, we're learning about strategy, we're learning about brand positioning and all these things, but yet when they leave the school, they take the same job as everyone else. How is this possible? So I started reflecting on all these things and decided that maybe one thing we should do is think about how we apply some of these insights to the way we live. And I want to start with an example, something we call the success trap. Many of you are familiar with this company, Government Motors. We all know about them. But you might also know something about these companies. All of these companies are on the screen for two reasons. Number one, they've all had a near-death experience. Some of them are dead. I mean, who would have thought 2 years ago that Lehman Brothers would be out of business today? Some of them are shadows of their former selves. They've recovered, they're good companies, but they're not what they used to be. Of course, it's always a good idea to take two lousy retailers and cram them together, and magically you've got one great big lousy retailer. And some are great companies yet again, like IBM. But the other reason that every one of these companies is on the screen is that every one of them was the absolute best company on the planet for a very long period of time in what they do. Now think about that for a second. Every one of these companies has had a near-death experience. Some of them are dead. Some of them are shadows of their former selves. And yet every one of them was the absolute best company on the planet in what they did for a very long period of time. This is why this innovation stuff is tough, because when you're doing well and you say, go change, try something else, what do people say? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Leave me alone, I'm hitting my numbers. Sometimes if you leave it alone before it's broken, it's too late to fix. And that's true about how we live too. So I'm thinking about this in terms of the decisions that I make and my friends and family make and my students make. And I started digging through the innovation research, my own and many other people's, and I started saying, what are some things we can learn from that? What are some things we can do differently to have a more successful life, maybe to have a more meaningful life? And these are 7 of them. I won't even go into all of them today due to time, but I'm building a cadre of these things as I work on a book, and I want to share a few of the stories with you. Keep the mission in mind, write down your questions, speak multiple languages, build non-obvious networks I would say, before you need them. Create option packs. Seek the wisdom in mistakes. And above all, as Plato said, know thyself. So let's start with keep the mission in mind. This fellow here on the slide is Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense. Bill came and spoke for one of my events out in Silicon Valley. The group I lead that Art mentioned is the Kellogg Innovation Network. We're a group of innovation leaders from large global corporations. And we're all sitting around a conference room at Cisco Corporation, and Bill Perry walks in. Bill is one of the most unassuming people you'll ever meet, but he's also one of the most powerful and inspiring. He's arguably the best Secretary of Defense this nation has had since World War II, although Gates is giving him a run for his money right now. He comes in and he speaks. I got to tell you, he had the absolute worst slides I've ever seen in my entire life. Times New Roman, bullet point, black and white font, no pictures. Absolutely a train wreck. But the message and the messenger were sublime. So he's talking, he's telling stories, and one of the stories he told was his first tour of duty at the Pentagon under the Carter administration. This was in the late 70s. And he said we had a fundamental problem, and the fundamental problem was that the Soviet Union had an overwhelming force advantage in Europe, conventional force advantage in Europe. He said there was no way that America or NATO in general could put enough boots on the ground or enough tanks in the field to protect against a Soviet decision to roll its tanks across Western Europe. This is not something we talked about very much in public. But the reality was at the time, if the Soviets had decided to roll their tanks across Western Europe, we would have had only one decision, and that was to bomb or not bomb. Not a very good decision. So he and his group said, we need other options, and they realized they needed to use what makes America great, and that's our technology. So he took a small team over to DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and said, what do you got? What's your greatest stuff? And they called through things. It took them about a month, and they selected 3 things: smart weapons, smart sensors, and stealth. And he said, get it done in 4 years. Now, you can probably guess why he said get it done in 4 years, right? Because in the government, you're probably going to be out on your can in 4 years, as was the case. But in any case, we all know the impact that these 3 technologies have had on the world since that moment. And so as Bill was speaking, again, very unassuming, very modest, I broke into his presentation. I said, Secretary Perry, I hate to interrupt, but I want to point something out to my high-powered executives here in the room. You have articulated a grand challenge, and by the way, the work that they did was part of what helped bring down the Soviet Empire. You've articulated a grand challenge, a solution, a strategy, and parameters of engagement, get it done in 4 years, on one slide in less than 40 words. And I looked at the rest of the executives in the room and I said, which one of your CEOs could articulate your company's strategy, the objectives, and the terms of engagement in less than 40 words on one slide? And they all slunk down in their seats and looked at the other way, which basically said none of us. Always keep the mission in mind. Second, write down your questions, and I mean this quite seriously. A lot of times we think we know what we're looking for, but we're not really sure. And when you sit down to write, you realize how little you know about what you're seeking. And the reason this is so important is cognitive science has proven to us that people only see the things for which they're looking. And I don't mean this generally, I mean this very specifically. People only see the things for which they're looking. This is an evolutionary adaptation. There is so much data in the universe hitting us at any given moment that there is absolutely no way that our systems could process and synthesize all of those data. So therefore, we have evolved in order to select the things out of our environment that confer upon us an advantage. So therefore, this means because it is an evolutionary adaptation, we have to do intentional things in order to leverage it. Let me give you an example. This fellow is Dr. Fleming. Now, many of you might know the kitschy little story about how he discovered penicillin. If you do, you probably don't know the right learning from it. Because most people look at this kitschy little story and they think that it tells them that innovation is therefore serendipitous. It is kind of, but let me tell you why that's not the right learning from this story. So the story that most people know is that Dr. Fleming was a messy clinician. And he walked into his lab one day, and there was some stuff in the petri dish that killed the bacteria. And he looked at it and he said, killed the bacteria. Doesn't kill me. Doesn't kill. He actually did that. I don't recommend you do that at home. Doesn't kill me. And thus was born the modern pharmaceutical industry, antibiotics. Additionally, had Fleming not done this, about a third of the people in this room today would not be here. So this was a transformative moment in the history of humanity. So a lot of people look at this story and say the chance event, the unexpected. He saw it, the light bulb went off, and thus was born penicillin. That is not the learning from this story. The learning from this story is that literally hundreds of people, hundreds of researchers, had seen exactly the same thing happen hundreds of times before. In fact, there were two researchers in the 1920s who wrote an article to help tell their colleagues, other clinicians, how to stop getting the stupid stuff in the petri dish that keeps killing the bacteria. And nobody made the connection. Nobody figured it out. What was different about Fleming? Well, there were two things. The first one we can't really control for. We have to give him credit for it. He was intensely creative, visionary fellow. Let's give him credit for that. But the second one we can learn from. And that was, he was in World War I. And during World War I, he saw thousands of people dying of infectious diseases. And so he made it his life's mission to understand bacteria in order to help protect human beings from it. So he always had this question, how do I protect humans from bacteria, in the back of his head. So the moment that he saw something that literally hundreds of people had seen hundreds of times before, he was the one who uniquely saw it. So I'd ask you, what questions are you asking? And don't assume you know. Sit down and write them out. And I'd also ask, what are the questions your loved ones are asking? Unless you ask them, you don't know. I'd also recommend, and again, science tells us that we've got lots of extra brain power, bandwidth running in the middle of the night, and if you read something before you go to bed, your brain is naturally processing it. So use that free time. If something's important to you, write it down, read the question before you go to bed, mull it over, and you're going to get some free bandwidth. Live in multiple worlds. So this is a fellow, Ron Bart, at the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. I'm not quite sure why they named Booth after the guy who shot Lincoln, but they did. They did. I'm not sure why. That was a joke, by the way, for all of you from Chicago. Ron is one of the great sociologists in the business academic space today, and he did a brilliant study. He left U of C and went to Raytheon for 3 years, became the vice president of learning. And there he studied how people come up with ideas and how they get them acted on. And he learned two really interesting things. Number one, people that have more than one deep knowledge area are better at coming up with good ideas. Now you could see how that might be. People who know a lot about finance and a lot about marketing are better at coming up with good ideas. I could kind of see why that is. But here's the punchline. It's not only marketing and finance, for instance. It could be you know a lot about finance and you know a ton about Italian opera. Or you know a ton about baseball. It didn't matter. It didn't matter what realms of knowledge, deep realms of knowledge you had. You came up with better ideas if you had more than one. But even more interestingly, people who had more than one realm of deep knowledge were better at getting others to invest in their ideas. We're better at convincing other people to take a risk, to join the team, to provide resources. Maybe because they're more able to be empathetic. They're more able to understand other people's language and translate, to take what they're passionate about and not speak in their own language, but speak in the other person's language. I would say, related to that, build non-obvious networks before you need them. I was talking to one of my kin members, Jørn Andersen, who's the innovation lead for the Nordic Council of Ministers, which is the umbrella government organization for the 5 Nordic countries. That's a picture of them there. They're very pleasant, colorful countries. And he said, we need to find some new knowledge. And I said, well, go out and find a place in the world with lots of knowledge that no one's connecting with. And so he said, well, how about Novosibirsk, New Siberia? Literally, these people were sent to Siberia. Stalin created a place where scientists and engineers could go and study the future with relative freedom. He sent them to Novosibirsk. And it was a great place during the Soviet age, but I got to tell you now, they're still stuck there, many of them. And so Jörn spent a very small amount of money to create an exchange program between Novosibirsk and the Nordic countries just about a year and a half ago. And today there are 2 commercial enterprises that have been founded based on the unique technologies developed at this isolated location in Siberia. I'll also tell you, if you go visit Novosibirsk, they're really happy you're there because they don't get a lot of visitors. My favorite anecdote by far, and the one with, I think, the most insight, is the following: seek the wisdom in mistakes. What happens in organizations usually when somebody makes a mistake, first reaction is shove it under the rug, hope no one sees it. Oh, if somebody saw it, then we start pointing fingers, right, and blame game, and then probably somebody gets pushed out or marginalized. It turns out if things don't go the way that you expected, perhaps there's a problem with your view of the universe. These 2 fellows, Michelson and Morley, did the most famous failed experiments in history in the late 19th century. They were trying to find what people called the luminiferous ether. This was the dominant hypothesis in the 19th century as to why it was that sound could not travel through a vacuum because there was no substrate within which it could travel, but yet, some reason, light could. So therefore, they felt if sound must have something in which to travel, then light must be traveling through something in the vacuum as well, and we just cannot see it. So they did these experiments, and the results kept confounding them. They kept reasoning, we must have screwed up the methodology, we must have, the equipment wasn't calibrated properly, etc. Well, there's another fellow, you probably recognize him, at the Swiss Patents Office who looked at the experiments and said, there is no problem with the experiment. There is a problem with the way that we look at the universe. And thus was born the special and general theory of relativity. Above all, know thyself. Are you someone who invents the future? Are you someone who is an executor who gets things done great every time? Diversify and prototype. Find new paths. It's very expensive and difficult to pull yourself out of your life at a moment, but I urge you to do it. And finally, recognize our common objective, and that is to create prosperity in the world. It doesn't matter if you're in business, government, academia, nonprofit, or the arts. Our common objective is to build a prosperous planet and prove Thomas Robert Malthus wrong again. This is Thomas Malthus, a recent photo. You might know of him. He was perhaps the first demographer in history, and with rigorous process at the time, he showed that agricultural production increases geometrically, population growth increases geometrically, and agricultural production increases arithmetically. Thus, somewhere in the midst of the 19th century, we will collapse in the weight of our own demands and mass starvation and conflagration and warfare. There were only 2 reasons he was wrong. One was the end of the Little Ice Age. He could have known nothing about this, but that did pump food production up a little bit at the beginning of the 19th century. The only other reason Malthus was wrong, that we are able to have 6 billion people on the planet today, that we will get to 9 or 10 billion this century, is innovation. Innovation driven largely by the private sector, but not exclusively. So I urge you to remember this as your mission for the rest of this century.